Good morning, philosophers. Time for a new book. We are returning to the Stoics. Why are we returning to the Stoics? Because, man, I was kind of over them there for after getting through Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, because some of the answers that Donald Robertson gave in the interview, which you should totally check out on the main Disenthrall channel, answered a lot of the problems and issues that I had with it. Answered sort of some of the contradictions that I saw in it. And so I am again motivated to return to the Stoics. So we began with the oldest Stoic influence, I suppose, maybe. Socrates through Plato, as you remember. That was like 400 BC is when he died. 399 BC is when Socrates was murdered. And then after that, we went all the way forward in time to Marcus Aurelius, who died in 180 AD. So several hundred years later. Now we're going to rewind the clock to like almost in the middle. We're going to start. This guy was born in 4 BC, and he lived until 65 AD when he was murdered by the emperor. A lot of these people are either emperors or they're murdered by emperors, or I guess the Senate in the case of Socrates. But they're either killed by the government or they are benevolent dictators-ish. Anyway, so we're going to be reading Seneca, who's one of the greatest Stoicists that ever lived. So we began at 400 BC, we moved to 180 AD, and now we're going right in the middle. This guy was born 4 BC, so 4 years before Jesus Christ was born, just to kind of nail the time frame. Basically, this guy was born a few years before Jesus. There's a link in the description to this book if you want to read this particular translation of the work. This is Letters from a Stoic. And as usual, I'm going to read parts of the introduction, probably not the complete introduction, because sometimes they run long and verbose. But yeah, the introductions are often good because they set up, from a historical perspective, whose words we're about to read. So, let's get started. Introduction. Seneca's life. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born at Cordoba, then the leading town in Roman Spain, at about the same time as Christ. His father, Marcus Annaeus Seneca, was an imperial procurator who became an authority on rhetoric, the art of public speaking and debate. He was the father not only of our Seneca, who speaks of his old-fashioned strictness, but also of Novatus, later known as Gallio, the governor of Achaea, who declined to exercise jurisdiction over St. Paul, and of Mila, less ambitious than his brothers, but an able financier, and father of the brilliant young poet Lucan? I don't know how to pronounce the C. I think it's a hard C. Lucan, maybe? Lucan? Whatever. Seneca suffered severely from ill health, particularly asthma. Throughout his life, he tells us that at one time the only thing which held him back from committing suicide was the thought of his father's inability to bear the loss. He spent a period of his early life in Egypt, where the husband of a devoted aunt named Marcia was the viceroy of the Emperor Tiberius from AD 16 to 31. There, acquiring experience in matters of administration and finance, he also studied the geography and ethnology of Egypt and India, and developed a lasting interest in natural science, speculative rather than empirical, although Pliny speaks of him as an authority on geology, marine life, and meteorology, and others have admired his remarks on, for example, evolution or the explanation of rings around the sun. His interest was drawn at an early age to Pythagorean mysticism and various cults of Eastern origin then gaining adherents in Rome, before his final acceptance in large part of the Stoic philosophy. After training for the bar, he took successfully to public life, becoming quaestor. I'm probably destroying that word. In spite of the handicaps of his health, his foreign background, and comparative lack of family or other connections, when Caligula succeeded Tiberius in AD 37, Caligula, Seneca had become a leading speaker in the Senate, and so aroused the jealousy of the new emperor that, according to Dio Cassius, he ordered his execution, and was only induced to let him off by a woman close to the imperial throne who said that Seneca was suffering from advanced tuberculosis and it would not be long before he died. This incident apparently resulted in his temporary retirement from political affairs. In AD 41, in the first year of the reign of Caligula's successor Claudius, Seneca again came under sentence of death, commuted to banishment, for reasons which we do not know. The pretext was adultery with Julia Livilla, the late emperor's sister. The more likely explanation is that the new ruler's consort, the notorious Messalina, considered him dangerous. His exile on the island of Corsica does not seem to have been endured as stoically as it might have been. The encouraging spirit of an essay of consolation sent to his dearly loved mother Helvia is entirely absent in another addressed to Polybius, an ex-slave who had become a trusted servant of the emperor, which contained some abject flattery and was probably never meant to be published. He had by now suffered the loss not only of his father but of a son, and his first wife died while he was away. The only solace for him in these 8 long years of loneliness and near despair was the reception given to the poems, tragedies, and essays to friends, which he continued composing during his banishment. His fortunes turned dramatically in AD 49. Messalina had been executed, and the emperor's new wife, Agrippina, had Seneca recalled to Rome, appointed to the high office of praetor, and made tutor to her 12-year-old son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. The boy was shortly to become the Emperor Nero. Yes, that Nero. Agrippina's motives, according to Tacitus, apart from the instruction of her son, were a confidence that because of his literary fame the move would gain them popularity, and a belief that he would prove a reliable ally and a useful advisor to herself and Nero in their plans for future power. There is no evidence that Seneca was connected with the poisoning of Claudius in AD 54. But he wrote the speeches which the 17-year-old Nero delivered after his accession, and was probably the author of a witty, if to us a little tasteless, attack on the dead ruler's memory, the apocolocyntosis, or pumpkinification, an imaginary tale of the rebuffs received by the recently deceased emperor when he presents himself at the portals of heaven, and his application for admission is debated by the gods. Nero did make a formal speech in honor of his predecessor, which was said to display a great deal of polish, and to be a good example of Seneca's attractive style, well tuned to the ears of his time. The new regime opened well, and Nero's first 5 years were later spoken of as a period of unequaled good government, the Emperor Trajan even calling them the finest period in the history of imperial Rome. For this Rome was indebted to Seneca and an army officer named Burrus. These two, quote, the most influential as well as the most enlightened of the men who surrounded Nero, quote, whose wide experience was common knowledge, prevented the hot-headed young man from carrying out a lot of murders on his accession and aimed at channeling some of his energies into, quote, permissible pleasures. Only briefly alarmed by the poisoning of Britannicus and acting throughout in complete harmony, they succeeded in keeping the public business out of Agrippina's hands and in their own. Tacitus ascribes the secret of the influence of Seneca to quote, his tuition of Nero in public speaking, and his engaging manners and high principles. That of Burrus to his, quote, military responsibilities and austerity of character. The two of them, quote, took over total power and exercised it, to the utmost of their ability, in the best and justest way conceivable, thus each alike arousing all men's approval. While Nero amused himself, they set about the problems of government. We notice, to give instances of their activity, legal and financial reforms, including the reduction of indirect taxation, and steps to prevent peculation and extortion by provincial governors, and the prosecution of a successful war in Armenia to settle the empire's eastern frontier. Seneca's geographical interests appear in the dispatch of an expedition, quote, to investigate the source of the Nile. Yet another of his interests was shorthand, the Roman system of which he is said to have completely revised. Neither he nor Burrus appears to have held any standing legal or constitutional office that could be said to give them the authority they wielded during these years. Seneca, quote, the real master of the world, seems simply to have been the moving force behind the throne. It is probably safe to say that Nero, unlike Aristotle's celebrated pupil at a similar age, Alexander the Great, was still under the influence of a teacher of undoubted personal charm, and was quite content to leave to him the direction of affairs in which he had little real interest. Once the young emperor began to listen to other advisers, and increasingly to indulge his more violent and vindictive impulses, this happy situation was doomed. In AD 58, Seneca was being attacked by people like Publius Suilius Rufus. Accusations seem to have ranged in gravity from sleeping with the emperor's mother — obviously the man had failed to learn his lesson from his thoroughly deserved banishment for, quote, seducing imperial princesses — and the introduction of the emperor to paiderasty, to the uselessness. Paiderasty? Is that the little boys thing? He was doing the little boys thing. Jeez. To the uselessness of his studies and the effectiveness of his oratorical style. But the campaign against him generally centered on the apparent contrast. It has been a stock criticism of Seneca right down the centuries, between his philosophical teachings and his practice. Instances of this hypocrisy, according to Suilius, were the philosopher's denunciations of tyranny, which did not stop him from being tutor to a tyrant, of flattery, ill according with the attitude he adopted, especially from exile towards ex-slaves who headed departments in Claudius's administration, of extravagance in spite of allegedly giving banquets served at 500 identical tables of citrus wood with ivory legs, and above all of wealth. Quote, what kind of wisdom, asked Suilius, what philosophical teachings had led him to acquire 300 million sesterces, I'm assuming that's a currency, within the space of 4 years in royal favor? The childless and their legacies had been, if he might so put it, enticed into Seneca's net. What? Oh. Whilst all Italy and the provinces were being sucked dry by his practice of lending money at unlimited rates of interest. End quote. Seneca was indeed already celebrated for his riches. Juvenal mentions, quote, the great gardens of the immensely wealthy Seneca. Agrippina, says Dio, had acquired for him untold wealth from all sources. The agricultural writer Columella mentions the remarkable productivity of his wine-growing estates, the best in Italy at Mentana. The reply, if any, which Seneca gave to his attackers' criticisms of his wealth was probably that contained in an essay on the happy life, sent to his brother Gallio. What counts, he says, is one's attitude to wealth, which is the wise man's servant and the fool's master. He, like any good Stoic, could lose all he had at any moment without being a whit less happy. This is the core of a long reply to the charge, which he states with complete frankness that, quote, philosophers do not practice what they preach. What? His everyday life did not lend countenance to such attacks. We have at least his own accounts of his plain diet and lifelong teetotalism, his hard bed, cold baths, and daily runs. And on this occasion he came to no harm from his enemies. In AD 59, Nero had his mother put to death, the murder being carried out in cold blood after the calamitous failure of an attempt to stage an accident at sea. There is reason to believe that Seneca and Burrus had no knowledge of or part in the planning of this crime, but, as the facts became known, did their best to lessen its impact on public opinion. Seneca certainly drafted the letter sent to the Senate explaining how her death was the result of the exposure of a dangerous plot of hers against the emperor's life. Dio would have us believe that Seneca averted a general massacre by saying to Nero, quote, "However many people you slaughter, you cannot kill your successor." Tacitus tells us that the death, probably murder, of Burrus in AD 62 broke Seneca's power. Enemies gained the ear of Nero with tales of Seneca's popularity and growing wealth. The first was represented as being dangerous to the throne, the second as overshadowing the possessions of the emperor himself, whose abilities as an artist and a speaker were also, it was said, being disparaged by his old instructor. Nero, they said, was now grown up, and it was time for him to, quote, shake off his tutor. Seneca, warned of this by friends, realized his danger and decided to ask the emperor for permission to retire from public life. The request was granted, and the parting was made amicable. And that is not the end of that story. We'll leave it there for today. Everybody, I hope you're well. I've got company at the house. We're preparing for a backpacking trip this weekend. It's going to be a good week. Going to get a lot done. Feeling good today. What am I thinking about? I have been taking a break from some of my habits to see if they're important, because it's important to try that. I think I've talked about that multiple times. This month has been taking a break from the keto diet, and I've decided that it was a good thing for me. So starting next month, I'm gonna start that again. I've been taking a break from some of my bullet journaling to see what that does to my productivity. And I've found that on days when I have little to do, it has little effect. And I've also found that a lot of things are starting to fall off the plate again and get forgotten about or get pushed off, or because I'm not doing that routine every day, it's easy to just, I'll get to it some other day, tomorrow maybe, whatever. So that will be something that I bring back soon. But yeah, it's important to test getting rid of some of everything in your life. I think this was a really cool piece of wisdom from the More Equal Animals book that we're reading on Disenthrall. I think we have maybe 1 hour left of reading that, and then we'll be done. But one of the coolest things in the book, one of the neatest points of wisdom, is that you should sort of randomly fast from everything in your life. Just randomly pick something that is routine, or something that you do all the time, or something that you would normally think you depend on, and just cut it out for an amount of time. Why? Because it makes you see it gives you all kinds of knowledge. How important was that thing? What thing depended on that thing? What alternatives do you have to that thing or that practice that can pick up the slack if you don't have it? And this goes for everything from resources to personal habits. I'm adding this stuff. This part wasn't from the book, but I'm applying it to my personal habits, my life, my everything. So far, every single time I've fasted from something, I have learned things that I would not have learned otherwise. So even electricity, that was a forced fast, right? We had the rolling blackouts in Texas, and that caused me to see just how powerful having a backup supply chain for electricity for my house was. And so I've made the supply chain for that much more robust. So if it happens again, man, my generator will just link straight into the house, and it will be no problem at all. Good stuff. Fast from things. I'm learning things from fasting from things. and not just food. Might be time for another food fast soon. Anyway, guys, have a great day.